The traffic stop. It was the kind of late afternoon that made everything seem still and calm, a brief pause before the hectic night fell upon the city. Kira Mason had just finished a long day of meetings, reviews, and troubleshooting problems at her cybersecurity startup. Now, as she cruised along the empty highway in her pristine Tesla Model 3, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The car was her pride and joy, a symbol of her hard work and determination. It was more than just a luxury vehicle. It was a piece of cutting-edge technology, built for efficiency, comfort, and style. Kira had always been fascinated by the future, and her car was a perfect representation of that. She loved the way it hugged the road as if it had a mind of its own, the smooth hum of the electric engine providing a peaceful backdrop to her thoughts. She leaned back in her seat, gliding past the low hills and vast stretches of open land. It had been a busy week, and she was more than ready to get home, kick off her heels, and unwind. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a warm glow across the road that stretched out in front of her. As the car's advanced autopilot system adjusted the speed to match the conditions of the road, Kira allowed herself to relax further, her fingers lightly tapping along to the music that filled the cabin. But then, as if to shatter the peaceful moment, the flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser appeared in her rearview mirror. Kira's body tensed immediately. She glanced at her speedometer. Everything seemed normal. She wasn't speeding. With a deep breath, she signaled and pulled her car over to the shoulder of the road. The gravel beneath the tires crunched softly as she slowed to a stop, her thoughts running a little faster than the car had been moments before. The officer's car rolled to a stop behind her, and Kira couldn't help but feel the unease creeping into her chest. She wasn't sure why. There had been no speeding, no erratic driving. Her car was clean, her record spotless. Still, something about the situation felt off. Through the side mirror, she saw a tall figure step out of the police vehicle. Officer Walter Hayes. His posture was stiff, almost too rigid. The way he moved, deliberate, calculated, spoke of authority, but there was something else, something that made Kira's skin prickle. She quickly adjusted her rearview mirror, keeping her focus on the road ahead. The sound of his boots crunching against the gravel grew louder, and Kira's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. Officer Hayes approached her window with a measured gait, his expression unreadable. As he neared, Kira glanced at him briefly, but quickly returned her attention to the rearview mirror. His face was sharp, his jaw clenched in a way that suggested either frustration or disdain, perhaps both. The flickering light from the police car illuminated the edges of his dark uniform, casting shadows over his features. He stopped at the driver's side window, and Kira felt a sudden wave of discomfort. She lowered the window, but before she could even get a word out, his voice interrupted her thoughts. "License and registration," he demanded, his tone cold, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. Kira blinked in surprise. She had barely registered his request before he had spoken, and something about his directness made her wonder if he had already formed an opinion of her. She had been pulled over before, but never with such sharpness, never with that undertone of suspicion in his voice. "Of course, officer," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady despite the nagging sense of unease in her chest. "But may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Officer Hayes didn't acknowledge her question. Instead, he took a step closer and extended his hand to receive the documents. Kira hesitated, but only for a moment, before she reached for her purse and retrieved her driver's license and the registration for her car. As she handed them over, Kira couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Officer Hayes didn't seem interested in answering her question, nor did he make eye contact. His attention remained fixed on the papers she'd handed him, as if he were studying them with a sense of purpose. He didn't even glance at the car. Kira's Model 3, sleek and modern, seemed to be an afterthought. He took the documents from her hand without a word, his fingers brushing briefly against hers. She noticed that he didn't seem in a rush to return them. instead holding onto the license and registration for far longer than necessary. Kira's mind raced, and she could feel her pulse quickening. Why was he acting this way? It was a simple traffic stop, but the tension in the air was palpable, thick with an unspoken energy that made her uneasy. "Do you have any idea why I pulled you over?" Officer Hayes finally asked, his eyes never leaving the papers in his hands. "No, officer, I don't," Kira responded, trying to maintain her composure. "I've checked my speed, and I haven't seen anything wrong. Was there an issue with my vehicle?" Instead of responding, he lifted his gaze for the first time, and Kira felt the full weight of his stare. His eyes were dark, calculating. She couldn't place it, but something about them sent a chill down her spine. Then, without another word, Officer Hayes turned and walked back to his cruiser. Kira watched him retreat, her fingers still gripping the steering wheel as she tried to make sense of the encounter. She couldn't understand it. Nothing about the situation felt right, but she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Perhaps she was overthinking it. After all, not every encounter with law enforcement was suspicious. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he reached the police vehicle, Kira's mind began to wander. She thought about her work, about her accomplishments, about the way she had fought tooth and nail to build her business from the ground up. She had worked harder than anyone, and she had done it all with integrity and grit. This wasn't just a random car. It was a symbol of everything she had achieved. Her Tesla Model 3 was more than just a high-end vehicle. It was a manifestation of her future, of the tech that had allowed her to pave her own path. But as her thoughts swirled, the uneasy feeling inside her intensified. She glanced back at the officer, watching as he stood next to his car, tapping something into his computer. He was taking longer than necessary. Could it be? Was he running her plates for some reason? What was he looking for? Before Kira could consider her next move, the unexpected happened. Without any warning, Officer Hayes returned to her window. But this time, there was something different in his demeanor, something predatory. "Get out of the car," he ordered coldly, his hand resting on his belt as if he was about to draw something. "You're coming with me." Kira's eyes narrowed in disbelief. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "Why would I get out of my car?" "This is an investigation," he said, his voice low. "I need you to step out of the vehicle. Now." The command was firm, and Kira's heart raced in her chest. Something was definitely not right. And as Officer Hayes stepped forward, Kira knew that the game had changed. The power shift. Kira's mind raced as Officer Hayes's words hung heavy in the air, his commanding voice like a trigger to something deep inside her. She felt the weight of the situation shift in an instant. She had been in control. Everything had been perfectly normal until now. But now she was being told to step out of her car for no clear reason. She could feel the anger rising in her chest, the sudden, sharp sense of injustice cutting through her like a knife. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter. "I'm not getting out of the car," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not going anywhere without an explanation." The officer's face hardened, and his eyes, which had initially seemed cool and professional, now took on an unsettling edge. It was as if the calm, authoritative demeanor had been replaced with something more dangerous, something that felt entirely too personal. Kira's instincts kicked in, and she could feel her heart beating faster, her breath shallow. For a moment, Officer Hayes didn't respond. He simply stood there, as if contemplating his next move, his eyes locked on Kira with a coldness that made her skin crawl. Then, without warning, he reached for the door handle, a sudden, aggressive motion that caught Kira off guard. But Kira wasn't going to let him get away with this. She didn't know what game he was playing, but she knew that she had to take control of the situation before it escalated further. Without thinking, she pressed the button on her car's console that would activate the security system. The Tesla's state-of-the-art technology immediately went into high alert, locking the doors with a sharp click that echoed through the tense air. "Don't touch the door," Kira said, her voice unwavering as she met his glare. If you try to force me out of this car, I'll have it on record, and I'll be filing a complaint immediately." For a brief moment, Officer Hayes seemed taken aback. He hesitated, as if calculating his next move, but his hands remained on the door handle. The tension between them was palpable, the silence pressing in on both of them as the minutes dragged by. Kira knew that every second counted. She had been in tight spots before, and she had learned to stay calm under pressure. But this was different. This wasn't just about a simple traffic stop anymore. She was being targeted, and the officer wasn't following protocol. He was making an unlawful demand. Kira glanced around, hoping to catch a glimpse of another car passing by. The road was empty, save for her and the officer. No witnesses, no one to intervene. She couldn't afford to hesitate. She had to act. "What's your badge number, officer?" she asked, her voice cool but firm. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. "Just stay in the car," he snapped, his tone harsher now. He didn't want to engage with her questions, didn't want to give her any more ammunition. But Kira had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to just sit there and let him get away with this. She had worked too hard to get to where she was, and no one was going to take that away from her. She had power too. It wasn't just her car, her technology, or her reputation. It was the knowledge and the resources at her disposal. And Officer Hayes, as she was beginning to understand, had vastly underestimated her. Kira's fingers hovered over the Tesla's control screen, her mind working quickly. She had installed the car with a suite of security features that most people didn't even know existed. She could remotely disable the car's systems, access real-time data, and even track the officer's movements with a few keystrokes. Her knowledge of technology was her greatest weapon. As Officer Hayes leaned in through the window, preparing to make his next move, Kira's hand shot out and pressed a button on the car's console. A soft chime sounded, followed by a whirring noise as the Tesla's advanced AI system kicked into action. "Is there a problem, officer?" Kira asked coolly, her tone calm, but laced with a hint of challenge. The officer's eyes flickered, a brief moment of confusion flashing across his face. He straightened, clearly aware that something had shifted in the dynamic between them. But before he could respond, the Tesla's internal systems activated, and the car's doors locked once more, ensuring that Kira was secure inside. Kira's eyes never left Officer Hayes as she watched the display on her screen. The car's cameras, strategically placed around the vehicle, began transmitting live footage of the officer, capturing every movement he made. She could see him now. Every step he took, every twitch of his fingers, every glance he cast in her direction. The Tesla was not just a luxury vehicle. It was a fortress. "You should know," Kira said, her voice low, almost a whisper. "This car is more than just a status symbol. It's an extension of who I am, my work, my reputation. You have no idea who you're dealing with." She let those words linger in the air, knowing they were going to land with impact. Officer Hayes blinked, his eyes narrowing as he processed what she had just said. The realization seemed to hit him a second too late, as if he had just understood the depth of his mistake. He stepped back from the car, his eyes darting nervously toward the flashing lights of his cruiser. Kira could see the hesitation in his movements, the subtle uncertainty that had begun to creep into his demeanor. But it wasn't just uncertainty. It was fear. "What are you talking about?" Hayes asked, his voice still tinged with defiance, but it lacked the same conviction from before. "You think you can threaten me with your little tech toys?" Kira's fingers danced over the screen again, and the Tesla's autopilot system sprang to life. The car's engine hummed softly, and a moment later, the vehicle's electric motors kicked into high gear. The car, still parked, began to move forward slowly, inching toward the officer. "Move," Kira said firmly, her gaze unwavering. Officer Hayes stumbled backward, suddenly panicked as the car, now under Kira's complete control, crept closer to him. It was only a few inches, but the message was clear. Kira was in charge now, and she wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. He put his hands up, stepping back in a frantic motion, realizing that the situation was quickly spiraling beyond his control. Wait, stop. Kira didn't respond. She pressed another button on the console, activating the car's powerful braking system. The car's motion halted instantly, but the effect was immediate. Officer Hayes was now on the defensive, his face flushed with fear. "You've made a grave mistake, officer," Kira said, her voice filled with calm authority. "You have no idea what you've just triggered." The officer backed away, but it was already too late. Kira's calm exterior hid the storm raging inside her. She had the power now, the power to turn the tables, and she was not going to back down. "You think you're in control here," Kira continued, her fingers still lightly tapping the console. "Let me show you what happens when you mess with the wrong person." In the distance, Kira could hear the faint sound of approaching sirens. It wasn't another officer, it was her backup. But for Officer Hayes, it was already too late. The tables had turned, and he was about to learn just how quickly things could go from bad to worse. The tables turn. The tension between Kira and Officer Hayes crackled like static in the air. He was no longer the confident authority figure he had once been. He was a man suddenly caught in a situation far beyond his comprehension. His eyes flickered nervously from Kira to her car, the gleaming Tesla now a menacing presence. Kira's fingers rested lightly on the touchscreen, her every move calculated. She wasn't afraid of this officer or the power he thought he wielded. He was now the one being outplayed. Officer Hayes, his earlier confidence quickly evaporating, looked around as if hoping for some external help to materialize. But it was just the two of them on that stretch of road, with the sun sinking lower, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the pavement. His cruiser was parked a few feet away, its flashing lights a stark reminder that he had made a fatal mistake in underestimating Kira. "You think you can scare me with your fancy toys?" Hayes snapped, trying to regain some semblance of authority. His voice, however, lacked the conviction it once held. The bravado he had earlier displayed was gone, replaced with desperation. Kira didn't respond immediately. She let the silence linger, letting him stew in his own anxiety. Every second that passed, the power shifted more into her hands. The car's cameras continued to track his every movement, feeding live footage to her screen. She could see his pulse racing as he struggled to maintain a facade of control. The officer was clearly rattled, his body language now speaking volumes about the fear beginning to creep into his mind. "You've made a grave mistake, officer," Kira said again, her tone unwavering but calm. She glanced at her screen, observing how his every twitch and shift of his weight was being recorded. The cameras were streaming the footage to her phone as well, and she made sure to save the data. If this situation escalated, she had evidence, hard evidence. Hayes swallowed hard, his face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He took a step back, his eyes flicking between Kira and the Tesla. He had no idea what he was dealing with, no idea that the car was more than just a high-tech machine. It was a weapon, an extension of Kira's genius. She had designed and customized its systems herself, every feature, every piece of tech. This wasn't just a luxury car. This was her domain, her creation. His frustration bubbled over, and he took another step backward, his hands twitching at his sides. "You're not getting away with this," he threatened, trying to sound more menacing than he felt. "You think I won't report you? You think I won't arrest you for obstruction?" Kira's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "You can try, but by the time you report anything, it'll be too late. You're already on camera, officer, and I have a few tricks up my sleeve you can't even begin to imagine." The officer's eyes widened. It seemed as though the reality of the situation was finally sinking in. He had walked into a trap he hadn't seen coming. Kira wasn't just some unsuspecting driver. She wasn't some woman at his mercy. She was a force of her own, with a mind that rivaled the very systems in her car. Kira shifted her gaze to the Tesla's main console and activated a function she had kept hidden, something that hadn't been publicly released in any model yet. Her Tesla was equipped with an advanced security feature that allowed her to remotely disable the car's systems. She wasn't just controlling it. She was commanding it, bending it to her will. The officer, standing helplessly a few feet away, still had no idea how deep this went. He didn't know that every movement, every decision, was being tracked and monitored by Kira, and that soon he would be completely at her mercy. She turned her head slightly, her eyes locked on Hayes, and in that moment, she took the reins fully. Without warning, the Tesla's engine roared to life, its tires screeching as the car accelerated toward him in a controlled but deliberate motion. The vehicle moved at a crawl, a mere few inches from him, but the psychological effect was powerful. Hayes took an involuntary step back, his eyes wide with panic. "Stop!" Hayes shouted, his voice cracking in fear. His earlier bravado had melted away completely. Kira knew that he had realized, perhaps too late, that he was no longer in control. His instincts told him to run, but he couldn't. He was trapped. Kira didn't answer him. Instead, she pressed a button on her console that activated the vehicle's defensive mode. The car's cameras zoomed in on him, capturing his every movement and transmitting the footage to multiple secure servers. The information was being logged, time-stamped, and saved. Kira had covered all her bases. If Hayes attempted anything foolish, if he tried to physically harm her or destroy the evidence, he would have a long road ahead of him, one filled with regret. "Do you understand now, officer?" Kira asked, her voice measured, her tone a mix of calm and control. "You're not in charge here anymore. This isn't your world. You're just a small part of it, trapped in a situation you can't escape from. Do you know how easy it is for me to make this all disappear? I'm in control of everything. And you're just standing there." Hayes's hands were shaking now, his entire body stiff with the realization that he had no leverage left. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, and Kira could see the panic rising in his eyes. He had misjudged her. He had thought that he could intimidate her, that he could throw his weight around and force her to comply. But he was wrong. So wrong. He tried to regain some composure, his voice now shaky. You can't get away with this," he muttered, though there was no confidence left in his words. "I'll have you arrested. You'll regret this." Kira shook her head slowly, her expression neutral but firm. "You don't get it, do you, officer? You're already too deep in this to get out. There's no one else here to help you. The truth is, you're powerless in this situation. The power has shifted, and now you're the one who's going to learn a lesson." With another soft click, Kira pressed a few more buttons, activating the Tesla's external loudspeakers. Through them, a clear, crisp voice rang out across the quiet stretch of road. "Attention, Officer Hayes. This vehicle has been recording your every move. You have been warned. Any further attempt to escalate this situation will result in your immediate arrest for abuse of power. You have no authority here." The words echoed in the stillness, and Kira could see Hayes's face turn pale. He took another step back, as if expecting the car to move on its own, to somehow advance toward him again. But Kira had made her point. The car's AI system, now in full control, had locked him into place. He was powerless, caught in a web of his own making. Kira's voice was calm as she spoke again. "You're not going anywhere, officer. You've crossed a line, and now you'll face the consequences. I'll make sure the whole world knows about this." Hayes's mouth opened, but no words came out. His fear had swallowed him whole. The man who had once stood in front of her with the arrogance of authority was now reduced to a trembling figure, trying to salvage whatever dignity he had left. Kira leaned back in her seat, her gaze unwavering as she let the silence fill the space between them. "Now let's talk about your next move." For Officer Hayes, there was only one thing left to do. He dropped to his knees. "Please," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Please, don't do this." And for the first time, Kira allowed herself to smile, the power in the situation now fully in her grasp. The tables had turned, and the man who had tried to control her was now the one begging for mercy. The reckoning. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an orange glow that bathed the road in a warm, almost serene light. But the serenity was the last thing Kira felt in that moment. Instead, she felt a cool, calculated calm that came with the absolute certainty that she had the upper hand. Officer Hayes, kneeling before her car, looked up at her with eyes wide in terror. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced by fear and confusion, but the most striking change was his sense of helplessness. Kira had never been one to back down when faced with adversity. Throughout her life, she had fought to overcome obstacles. Barriers of gender, race, and skepticism from others who thought she didn't belong. But this moment, this was different. It wasn't just about overcoming a challenge. It was about taking control when the world tried to force you into submission. It was about teaching a lesson, about showing the world that power could be reclaimed, even from the most unlikely places. Officer Hayes's hands were shaking now, his face pale as he knelt on the gravel, his posture crumpled in defeat. His pride, which had once been the source of his harsh demeanor, had evaporated completely. The man who had thought he could overpower her, who had thought he could intimidate her into submission, was now begging for mercy. The air around them felt heavy. Kira could hear his shallow breathing, the way his chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven intervals. His voice, when he finally spoke, was strained. I didn't mean to." Hayes started, his words stumbling over themselves. Kira didn't interrupt him. Instead, she waited, her hands resting on the wheel, her expression calm but resolute. She didn't need to rush. She wasn't the one pleading for mercy. He was. "Please, don't do this," he repeated, his voice more desperate now. "You don't have to do this. I'm just doing my job. I was just following orders." The words were hollow, empty excuses that Kira had heard time and time again in her life. Excuses made by people who believed their positions gave them the right to treat others however they wished, regardless of justice or fairness. Kira's mind flicked back to the countless moments in her life when she had been underestimated, when people had written her off simply because of her appearance, because of her gender, or because of her age. She had spent years building a reputation in the tech world, breaking barriers that others told her were insurmountable. But today she was proving something far greater. She was showing that no one, no matter how high they thought they stood, was above accountability. Kira leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the officer before her. His hands were clasped together in a futile attempt to ward off the inevitable, his face still drenched with fear. He was utterly helpless. "Following orders, officer?" Kira asked, her voice cool, almost mocking. "Is that what you're going to hide behind? That's what you always fall back on, isn't it? When things get tough, when you get caught doing something you shouldn't, you blame it on someone else. Always someone else." The officer didn't respond immediately, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to find the right words, but nothing came. His pride had been shattered. He was powerless now, trapped by his own actions. Kira took a slow breath, not out of empathy, but out of control. The moment had arrived, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. She pressed another button on her console, activating the car's cameras once more. She had already sent the footage to a secure server, but now, with a few keystrokes, she was broadcasting it live. The world would know what had happened here. "Do you know what's about to happen to you, Officer Hayes?" Kira's voice was ice cold, her words like a dagger cutting through the air. "Do you have any idea what it's like to lose everything in an instant? To be exposed for the fraud that you are?" Hayes shook his head, but Kira could see that his gaze had shifted now. It wasn't just fear she saw in his eyes. It was the realization that his world was crumbling around him. His badge, his job, his authority. They meant nothing now. In this moment, he was nothing more than a man who had made a critical mistake. "No, I didn't," Hayes stammered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know who you were. I didn't mean to do it. Please, just let me go." Kira's gaze softened, just for a moment. Not out of sympathy, but out of understanding. She had seen this before. The desperate scramble to find a way out when someone's true nature was revealed. But there was no escape for Officer Hayes. There was no mercy for someone who had chosen to wield their power recklessly, no matter how much they begged for forgiveness. "You didn't know who I was?" Kira asked, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "That's the best excuse you can come up with. I'm not surprised. You see, Officer Hayes, people like you don't care about the individuals you step on. You don't care about the people you hurt. You just go through the motions, not even thinking about the lives you affect." Kira's mind raced as she spoke, the frustration building in her chest. She had heard this excuse too many times. People who thought they could get away with their actions simply because they didn't recognize the worth of others. Kira wasn't going to let him hide behind ignorance. She wasn't going to let him off the hook, just because he was trying to save face. "The thing is," Kira continued, her words deliberate, "I'm not just anyone. I'm not some random person you can intimidate with your badge. I built my life from the ground up. I created something from nothing. And you thought you could take what I worked so hard for, didn't you?" Hayes didn't say anything this time. He couldn't. His earlier bravado had evaporated entirely. Now he understood. The woman he had tried to bully wasn't a helpless victim. She was a force to be reckoned with. She had taken control of the situation and was showing him just how powerless he truly was. Kira pressed another button on the car's console, this time locking the doors. The Tesla's security system whirred to life, its lights flashing briefly before returning to normal. "I'm not going to let you get away with this, Hayes," Kira said softly, her voice calm, but filled with an underlying power. "Not because I want revenge, but because people like you need to be shown that their actions have consequences. You can't just take what isn't yours and walk away unscathed. There's always a reckoning." Hayes, now fully aware of how deep he had gotten himself into trouble, started to inch backward, his hand still raised in a futile gesture of surrender. "I'm sorry," he muttered repeatedly, his words almost incoherent as the reality of the situation continued to sink in. "I'll do anything. Please, just let me go." Kira's lips parted, but this time, there was no mocking tone, no anger, just a quiet resolve. "The problem is, officer," she said, her voice unwavering, "you're not the one in control anymore. I am, and you're going to learn exactly what that feels like." The silence between them hung heavy. Hayes's desperate eyes met hers, but he knew there was no escape. He had miscalculated, and now he was about to face the consequences of his own actions. Kira wasn't interested in revenge. She wasn't looking to humiliate him. But there was something far more powerful than that in the air now. It was the truth, the undeniable fact that when you abuse your position, when you think you can crush someone beneath you, you risk losing everything. And Kira was making sure that Hayes learned that lesson in the most profound way possible. The tables had turned, and Officer Hayes was no longer the one in power. He had become the lesson. The descent. The oppressive silence stretched out as Officer Hayes remained kneeling, his face a mixture of disbelief and desperation. Kira, her gaze fixed on him, allowed the weight of the moment to sink deeper. She had played her cards perfectly, patient, measured, and in complete control. But this wasn't just about one officer's downfall. It was about something larger. It was about the system, the abuse of power, and the countless others who had suffered at the hands of people who thought they could get away with anything. Kira wasn't interested in vengeance, but in making sure that those who wielded power unjustly were held accountable. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the once golden light had been replaced by the cool blue of dusk. The street, which had been empty for so long, now felt like an isolated world, a world where time had come to a standstill, and everything that had come before was now irrelevant. All that mattered now was the reckoning that was unfolding. Kira sat back in her seat, her fingers resting lightly on the controls, her mind racing through the next steps. She didn't want to act in anger, but she couldn't let Hayes walk away from this without learning the truth. He needed to see just how wrong his actions had been, how blind he had been to the reality of what he'd done. And most of all, he needed to understand that someone like Kira, someone he had probably written off as just another target, wasn't going to let him off the hook. Her eyes narrowed, watching him as he continued to kneel, his hands trembling slightly, the sheen of sweat on his forehead catching the fading light. He had no idea what he had walked into. Kira could see it now. The fear had become his only companion. And in that moment, he realized the full extent of his mistake. The power had shifted, and it wasn't just about the car or the technology. It was about the person behind it all. Kira's voice broke the silence. "I bet you thought you could get away with this," she said, her words calm but heavy with meaning. "You thought you could take a woman's property, treat her like she didn't matter, and walk away without consequences. But you're wrong, officer." He lifted his gaze, his eyes pleading, but Kira saw the realization begin to form. Hayes had finally understood that he wasn't in charge anymore. It wasn't just the Tesla that had control, it was the mind behind it. A mind that was capable of thinking 3 steps ahead, of anticipating every move. She had been prepared for this moment long before it ever came, and now she wasn't going to waste it. "Please," Hayes muttered again, his voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who you were. I was just doing my job." Kira leaned forward, her gaze steady, and there was no mistaking the coldness that had settled in her expression. "You were just doing your job," she echoed, her voice low. "Let me tell you something, officer. People like you use that excuse all the time. You're not fooling anyone. You knew what you were doing, but you thought you could take a shortcut. You thought you could hurt someone without ever facing the consequences. Well, guess what? The game's changed." Hayes's hands were still raised, though now it was more out of a last-ditch effort for survival than authority. He didn't want to admit it, but he was a prisoner of his own choices. Kira had exposed the cracks in his bravado, the vulnerability behind the badge, and now he was stuck in a place he couldn't escape. Kira pressed a button on her console again, and the car's internal system flashed. For a moment, Hayes tensed, but then the car's lights dimmed, and Kira's screen showed him exactly what she wanted him to see, a live feed of the incident. Every interaction, every word, was captured in high definition. Her voice remained steady as she continued. "This is your confession, Officer Hayes," she said, watching the officer closely as his face paled further. "And guess what? I'm uploading it. The world will know exactly what you did tonight. You will answer for your actions, whether you like it or not." Hayes's mouth went dry. "No, please. You can't. I'll lose everything. My job, my career." "And that's the point," Kira replied, her voice calm but unwavering. "You can't just go around abusing your position, assuming no one will hold you accountable. Tonight, you've learned the hard way that actions have consequences." She wasn't angry. Not really. But the injustice of it all made her heart beat faster, her pulse quicken. She had spent years building a life for herself, earning everything she had through sheer determination, while people like Hayes thought they could trample over others without a second thought. Kira wasn't going to stand by and let that go unchallenged. Not anymore. He swallowed, his voice now barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. Please. I won't do it again. Just let me go. I'll make it right." Kira shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. "Sorry doesn't cut it. Officer, you don't get to just apologize and walk away from the harm you've caused. That's not how the world works. You don't get to hurt people just because you're in a position of power." Hayes stood up slowly, his movements hesitant, as though he was trying to gather his bearings, but Kira could see the desperation in his eyes. He was trying to regain some control over the situation. But the more he tried, the more powerless he seemed. He was still trapped in her world, caught in the web of his own making, unable to escape. "You have no idea what it's like," he muttered, his voice breaking. To be in my position, to do what they ask. Don't try to make yourself a victim here, Hayes. Kira interrupted, her voice sharp. You chose this. No one made you abuse your power. No one forced you to pull me over for no reason, to harass me. You chose this path. Now you'll face the consequences. The officer's shoulders slumped, the weight of her words sinking in. The fear that had been simmering underneath his bravado was now boiling over, and there was no mistaking it. He was a man who had been caught in the act, and there was nothing he could say or do to change that. His career was over, his credibility shattered, and Kira wasn't about to let him off the hook just because he begged for mercy. I want you to understand something, officer, Kira said, her voice now softer, though still carrying the weight of authority. This isn't just about you. This is about every person you've ever treated like they don't matter. Every person you thought you could step on and get away with it. This is bigger than you, and tonight, the world is going to see that. Her hand hovered over the car's controls once again, but this time, she didn't press anything. She had made her point. The damage had been done, and Hayes now understood the gravity of the situation. Kira took one final glance at him. His face, now drained of color, was a mask of regret, fear, and helplessness. But Kira didn't feel pity. She felt something stronger, the certainty that she had done the right thing. Get in your car, officer, and don't ever think you can do this again. He hesitated for a moment, but then, without a word, he turned and climbed into his cruiser. Kira watched as he drove away, her gaze unwavering. She knew the road ahead for him was going to be long and full of consequences, but in that moment, it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the message that had been sent. The world was about to learn what it meant to mess with Kira Mason, and there was no going back. The aftermath. The world had changed for Officer Hayes, and as he drove away into the fading twilight, Kira's eyes stayed fixed on his retreating form, her mind still processing everything that had just transpired. The road, once a symbol of calm and solitude, now felt ominous, carrying the weight of what had just happened. The officer's cruiser grew smaller in her rearview mirror, but Kira knew that, despite his escape, he couldn't outrun the consequences. Not this time. She took a deep breath, the cool air flooding her lungs, trying to ground herself. She wasn't shaken by the events that had unfolded, not really. It was all part of a larger mission, part of a much bigger story, a story about power, control, and the people who believed they could get away with wielding both for their own benefit. Kira had proven that no one was untouchable. She had fought back, and in doing so, had reshaped the balance of power, if only for a moment. But that moment would ripple outward, and its effects would be far-reaching. Kira didn't rush to leave the scene. She stayed in the car for a few minutes longer, allowing herself the space to collect her thoughts. Her Tesla's systems hummed softly, a comforting presence in the midst of the chaos she had just orchestrated. The car, which had once been a mere possession, had become a tool of revolution, a catalyst for change. It was the vehicle that had not only given her the upper hand in a tense encounter, but had also given her a platform to expose the corruption and abuse that many others were too afraid to confront. As she sat there, she replayed the moments in her mind. Officer Hayes had been sure of himself, certain that his badge would shield him from any repercussions. But Kira had shown him the truth, that badges and titles were nothing when stacked against the power of justice. She had thought carefully about every move, planned out each step, and used her intellect, her resources, and her car's advanced technology to expose the officer for what he truly was, a man who had forgotten the very oath he had sworn to uphold. But it wasn't just about Hayes. It wasn't just about this one officer's failure. This moment symbolized something bigger. It was a challenge to a system that often overlooked the marginalized, a direct confrontation with an authority that believed it could act without consequence. Kira had taken back control, not only for herself, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless, everyone who had ever been dismissed, ignored, or belittled by those who thought they could operate above the law. The cool night air now felt refreshing, like a new beginning. Kira tapped a few commands into the Tesla's console, closing out the system that had recorded everything. The footage of the encounter was safely stored on her secure servers. No matter how much Hayes might try to spin his version of the story, she had the evidence, and it was irrefutable. She had outplayed him at every turn, and now she would ensure the world saw the truth. As she made her way back home, Kira felt a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction. It had been a long day, an emotional roller coaster, but it had been worth it. She wasn't naive. She knew the repercussions of what she had done. There would be whispers. There would be calls for her to explain herself. But Kira didn't need to justify her actions. She had done what was right. The following days were a whirlwind. Kira's world, which had been relatively quiet and focused on her work in the tech world, was suddenly thrust into the public eye. News outlets began picking up the story, and social media exploded with reactions. People, both for and against her actions, began voicing their opinions. Some hailed her as a hero, a woman who had stood up against the system and shown that no one was above the law. Others, however, criticized her methods, calling her actions reckless and dangerous. But Kira didn't care. The message had been sent, loud and clear. The status quo had been challenged, and there was no going back. What surprised Kira, though, was the sheer number of people who supported her. Messages of encouragement flooded in from all corners. People who had been victims of injustice, who had been mistreated or misjudged, thanked her for speaking up, for showing them that they didn't have to remain silent. Kira was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support, but she knew this wasn't just about her. It was about a movement, about changing the narrative, about showing people that they could fight back too. As the days passed, the pressure on Officer Hayes began to mount. His superiors were forced to take action. Internal investigations were launched, and news of the incident spread like wildfire. Kira's decision to upload the footage and expose the truth had been calculated, and now, as the consequences unfolded, she saw the full scope of her actions. The officer had lost everything: his job, his reputation, his credibility, and Kira felt no sympathy for him. She had known from the beginning that this would be the outcome, but what mattered now was that the truth had been revealed. It wasn't just the officer who had been affected. The incident ignited a wider conversation about police misconduct, racial profiling, and the abuse of power. Kira's actions had brought these issues to the forefront of public discourse, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths. She didn't care if she was criticized for her methods. What mattered was the change that was starting to take shape. It was no longer just about a single officer and his mistakes. It was about the ripple effect that would force others to be held accountable. Kira didn't seek out fame or recognition. She didn't want to be a symbol. What she wanted was simple: to make sure that no one could abuse their position of power without facing the consequences. She knew that the world wasn't perfect, that justice was a long road. But in that moment, she had set something in motion. A shift, a spark that would burn brighter as more people saw the example she had set. It wasn't easy. There were still those who criticized her, who didn't understand her actions. Some tried to discredit her, to label her as a vigilant or a troublemaker. But Kira stood firm. She knew that the truth was on her side. And the more she heard from those who supported her, from the people who had long been silenced, the more certain she became that she had made the right choice. In the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Kira allowed herself to reflect on the larger meaning of her actions. She thought about the countless others who had suffered injustice, who had been ignored or overlooked by a system that claimed to protect them. She thought about how much work there still was to be done, how many more walls needed to be broken down, how many more systems needed to be dismantled. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. Kira had taken a stand, and now, more than ever, she knew that she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed their voices heard. Because in the end, it wasn't about a car or a single officer. It was about something much bigger. It was about making the world a place where power was held accountable, where justice wasn't just an ideal but a reality, and Kira Mason was ready to lead that charge.